The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Unmuted.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. What now? How to proceed when automatic forecasting doesn't work. My name is Eric Sabatis, and I will be moderating the webinar today. Eric Stellwagen will be presenting the webinar, which will start in a few minutes. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few minutes to go over some logistics. The webinar will run approximately 60 minutes. Eric will be presenting methods and strategies to use when automatic forecasting doesn't get the job done. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. At any time during the webinar, you can submit questions using the control panel on your screen. We will be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar and compile a list for Eric to address during the Q&A session. So please don't hesitate to send questions to me as they come to you. We will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. However, if you submit a question and we don't get to it, we will answer you via email after the webinar has concluded. We are also taping this webinar for later viewing. You will also receive an email from us next week letting you know when the webinar is available for viewing. Thank you for your time, and now without further ado, here is Eric Stellwagen to present What Now? How to Proceed When Automatic Forecasting Doesn't Work.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And let's get started. So, as Eric mentioned, my name is Eric Stellwagen. I am the Vice President and a co-founder of Business Forecast Systems. We are a company located outside of Boston that develops and markets forecasting software. Our flagship product is the Forecast Pro product line. I've basically spent my entire career in forecasting. I've been doing it, as the slide says, for over 27 years. Originally, I was working at an engineering company, and I developed forecasting software for electric power companies. In 1986, I left that company and started Business Forecast Systems. And in 1987, we came out with Forecast Pro. So again, I've worked in the industry for quite a long while. I've done a lot of consulting, training, workshops, literally for hundreds of companies. It's actually, for forecasting, it served me rather well to be able to go into large, small companies, see how their forecasting processes work, see the kinds of issues that they struggle with, because forecasting really is a combination of experience and how to apply methodology. So here's a roadmap of what we're going to do for the next hour. It's a pretty general presentation. We're going to be covering a lot of ground. We'll start with an overview, which talks a little bit about business forecasting and the types of approaches that people use. We'll talk a bit about judgment. Judgment's an important part of forecasting. And then we'll move on to the main theme, which is automatic forecasting. And so we'll talk about the pros and cons of using an automatic approach to generate forecasts based on past demand history. What happens when it doesn't work well? Well, that's the theme of the webinar. So we'll look at a variety of different methods, things like specifying specific models, methods for new products, top-down approaches, multivariate approaches. We'll be covering a lot of different approaches that you can use to improve your forecasting when an automatic approach fails. So, how do people go about forecasting? Well, almost every survey that's taken will often have questions about what software people use. And it probably won't surprise you to find out that the most popular forecasting package is Excel. And so the majority of or the market-leading forecasting software is Excel. People do very simple spreadsheet models. They do things like same as last year, or maybe same as last year plus a percentage. And they temper that with judgment. So I use a simple spreadsheet model, and I use judgment, and I come up with a forecast. This is a very common, but can be improved upon greatly by moving to methods which generate superior baseline forecasts. And the next group on the slide is time series methods. Time series methods are methods which base the forecasts on the past demand. So basically, they're extrapolation methods. They typically are going to project things like trends and seasonal patterns. They work well when there's a lot of continuity between the past and the future. More advanced methods would bring in more than just the past history. So multivariate methods are a group of methods where we might be bringing in things like promotional schedules, measures of the economy, prices. So in addition to just looking to the past, we're looking for things that are driving what we're trying to forecast. I've put a different category for new products. New products are usually some of the hardest things to forecast, frankly. And there are a variety of methods that are designed specifically for new product forecasting. So this slide is listing some of the common approaches that people use for forecasting, and we'll be looking at a number of the entries on these slides throughout the presentation. When a company begins its forecasting journey, let's call it, it often has several phases. And the first phase is somebody tells you you're now responsible for generating forecasts. And you have no formal training in forecasting. And you sort of say, well, what am I going to do? So you think, well, I've got Excel. Maybe I'll look at what we've been selling in the past. Maybe I'll talk to the people at the company, talk to the salespeople, talk to the demand planners, see what they think is on the horizon. And between the spreadsheets and adding judgment, we'll come up with a forecast. And depending on the size of your company and the number of items that you're forecasting and how your products are sold, this phase one approach, based mostly on spreadsheets and judgment, might serve you okay for a while, but it can be improved upon. And that sort of brings us to phase two. Phase two is where we automate the process, where the spreadsheets become too unwieldy. Maybe I'm now dealing with forecasting on an SKU basis, a stock keeping unit basis. Maybe I'm dealing with thousands of items and I really just can't do this on a spreadsheet. Or maybe I just want to improve the accuracy and I know that my simple spreadsheet models can be improved upon. So phase two is usually we explore using some automated approaches based on the past history. So that's automatic time series approaches. And typically what will happen is this will give us a much better baseline forecast, and we may still be adding judgment because judgment's always important, but we're going to improve our process quite a bit by going from phase one to phase two. We should think of forecasting as something that should be a continuous improvement process. So as I improve my forecasting process, I should always be looking around saying, what can I do next? How can I improve it yet further? And that brings us to phase three. Phase three is where we've been using automatic approaches. We may find that for some of our items it's not working very well. So maybe for the new products, the automated approach really isn't performing well. And so we're going to customize different approaches. So very typically, as a company establishes a forecasting process and as it evolves over time, these are often kind of the phases that people go through. And before we jump into why automatic forecasting goes wrong, we're going to start with just a few comments about judgment. First of all, judgment is always going to be part of a forecaster's job. Sometimes in the form of deciding that the automatic methods are working well. Sometimes in deciding that they're not. Sometimes in looking at a statistical forecast and making adjustments. But you're always going to use judgment. And a forecaster is ultimately responsible for the forecast, even when it's generated using an automatic algorithm. And so judgment is always going to be important. Some good things about judgment. Well, you don't have to be a statistician. It does not require statistical expertise to come up with a judgmental forecast. It allows you to incorporate what I call domain knowledge, or knowledge of the company, knowledge of the products, knowledge of the future. And sometimes incorporating this kind of knowledge could be very difficult in a statistical method. So the judgment is the way to get sort of that non-quantitative information into the forecast. And maybe we've done, research. Maybe we've talked to customers. Maybe we've got feedback from sales. Maybe we've got a formal S&OP process to get insights from around the company. But again, judgment is an important part of being a forecaster and will always be a part of your forecasting process. Another nice thing about judgment is it doesn't require historical data. There are some downsides to judgment. It's highly subjective. A lot of times a judgmental forecast is more of a goal than a realistic forecast. It can be very biased, particularly if I'm trying to come up with a consensus between different members of the organization. If I'm in a room with the senior vice president and a demand planner and a person who works in the mailroom, who may be a very good forecaster, and we try to come up with a consensus, the mailroom person's voice is not going to be heard. Okay? So again, as a judgmental forecast, particularly when there's more than one person involved, is subject to many biases. It's also difficult to improve a system that's based on a judgmental forecast. So if my process is highly judgmental, I can monitor the accuracy of our forecast and I can determine where it's not very good, but knowing how to improve it is difficult. Whereas if I'm using a statistical approach or an automatic approach, let's say, I can look at areas where the forecast is underperforming, and I can analyze that, and I can adjust that approach accordingly. But if my process basically is a human judgmental based one, then it can be very difficult to improve. Another problem is it's not automatic, and it can be very time-consuming, which equates to being very expensive. So again, there's a lot of downsides to judgment. On the other hand, it's important. So kind of bottom lining some some best practices here. Judgment is important. It will always play a role in forecasting. There are certain instances where judgment will be particularly important. New products, where I don't have demand history. Products with very short life cycles. Products, if I'm in an industry or an organization where the environment is changing rapidly. So maybe I'm in a technology company where using methods based on the past really doesn't make very much sense due to the fact that things are changing so rapidly. And any instance where the domain knowledge can't really be captured in the forecast. So if we've got salespeople who are really in touch with our customers, creating the demand, getting their feedback is an important part of the process. So judgment's important. On the other hand, the second bullet is telling us, as a strong recommendation, and it is a strong recommendation, is that we add judgment in the form of an override to a statistically generated baseline forecast. And I am a real believer in this, and it's not just because my company sells forecasting software. This concept of if you go up to somebody and say, what do you think? Give me a forecast. That's a very different practice than going up to a salesperson and saying, the statistical forecast, which is sort of assuming the current trend and the current kind of seasonal patterns, is projecting 20,000 units next month. What do you think? Should we raise that? Should we lower that? This is a very different exercise. The salesperson may come back and say, yes, we should raise that. I've been talking to Walmart. They're planning on running a promotion on this item. Your model didn't capture that. We should increase production in anticipation of this. So it's perfectly valid to adjust the baseline, in fact necessary at times, but by providing the baseline and asking for the judgment in the form of an adjustment, we're putting more accountability into the process. We're also capturing two things ideally. How is the baseline forecasting performing? How accurate is it? And let's also track how the adjusted is. And when we do that, and when we provide a feedback loop, then we can start to understand where judgment is important. What items really do we need to spend our time with? And where is it perhaps not helping the process at all? Where can we simply automate it and go with the baseline and not worry about it? So again, strong recommendation is that we start with a baseline forecast, typically a statistically generated one, and then we add judgment in the form of an adjustment. Okay, on to our main theme, which is automatic time series approaches and what to do when they don't work. So before we begin here, we're going to think about data. An automatic approach, an automatic algorithm, is going to work on the past history. And the past history is just numbers. to an automatic program. So a piece of software doesn't know what your products are. It just knows that you gave it some data, and it's going to manipulate it statistically. So here's an example. I've got 3 data points. First one's a little over 37,000. The next one is a bit less than that, and the third one's right around 37,000. So I've got 3 data points, and I put this into an automatic forecasting approach. What's going to happen? Well, there's not a lot you can do with 3 data points. Basically, it's going to average them. That'd be a very reasonable thing to do. So the forecast is going to be a flat line at about 37,000. Is that a good forecast? Well, given what we know, which is only the 3 data points, I would say yes. Is it a good forecast if I know that this is sales of my products and I know what these 3 numbers represent? Probably not. Here's a question. Is this a seasonal product? An automatic approach to this isn't going to have any clue. We've got 3 months worth of data. We can say nothing about the seasonal pattern, if there is one. So again, we need more data for the automatic approaches to get a little more interesting. And here's what happens if we have a year's worth. So we've got 12 months worth of data. You know, for some organizations, this is a lot of data. You know, maybe I've got very short product life cycles. What are we going to, is an automatic approach going to do with this? Is it seasonal? Gee, I don't know. It wiggles, you know, it goes up and down here. Is that because it's seasonal? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just sort of selling some sort of average amount here, and any given month it's above or below that just because of random variation. To be able to tell if something is seasonal automatically, I need to have about two or more years worth of data, because then I can start comparing the same period from year to year. I don't have that here. So if I'm using an automatic approach, I'm not going to get a seasonal pattern unless or not from the completely automated approach. I need more data. And of course, that's the whole point of walking through this data. Here's 2 years worth of data, and things start to get interesting at this point. I can start to look year to year, and I can say, hey, those troughs here fall in the same month. And in fact, if I look at the pattern, it does repeat itself. It's not perfect, but it repeats itself from year to year. And I could pretty confidently, and an automatic algorithm could pretty confidently determine that this is seasonal, and my forecast would now be seasonal. Is it trended? Should I be forecasting this as increasing or decreasing? It looks pretty flat, and I could run some statistical tests, and it would probably, at this point, give me a flat forecast with a seasonal pattern. Let's get some more data. Here's 3 years. That third year is a bit higher. And I would look at this and say, did the level change? I had been down here, and now I'm up here. So should I forecast up here? Or is this an emerging trend, and I should forecast going upward? Again, it's tough to say by looking at this graph. But with this amount of data, the automatic methods are going to really start to be coming into their own. And let's get a lot of data. Okay, so here's 6 or 7 years worth of data. And now, looking at this, everything is exceedingly obvious. Is it seasonal? Oh yeah, it's very seasonal. Is it trended? Absolutely. We've got a strong upward trend. It was a little flat in the beginning, but with lots of data, things become clear. And this is the message. Lots of data, things become clear. Okay, without lots of data, it can be very difficult. So again, think back when I showed you just the first 3 data points, and then consider working with this as the data stream. A very different exercise. Automatic approaches are going to work very well when we've got 6 years worth of data. They're not going to work very well when we only have 3 months. Okay, so let's continue. So some pros and cons of automatic approaches. Well, it's pretty simple to understand. Basically, they're extrapolating. They're pulling out trends and seasonal patterns and projecting them forward. They're widely accepted and widely implemented. They are behind almost every planning system and ERP system will have modules for forecasting that have automated approaches. So lots of forecasts are being generated using automatic time series-based approaches. They can often be quite accurate. They're adaptive, at least if implemented well. So if things are changing, if the trends are changing in time, if the seasonal patterns are changing in time, we can get at that with automatic approaches. They're easy to apply. Clearly, with an adjective like automatic, we would think it'd be pretty easy to apply this. Okay. What's the downsides? Oops, my finger moved too quickly. The downsides. I need history, and that was the point of the exercise we just completed. So for this to work well, I need some history. I'm assuming continuity. If I'm going to extrapolate based on past demand, then I must assume the future is going to be an extension of the past in some regards. And so I need some continuity between past and future. There are certain things I'm not going to be able to capture with this type of approach. I'm not going to capture anything that moves around the calendar. So something like a promotion. If last year we promoted in January, and the year before that we promoted in June, and next year we're planning on promoting in February, that's going to be very difficult to capture using an automatic time series approach, which is strictly based on the past history. You're going to need more than the past history when things start to move around the calendar. So again, we can get at seasonal patterns because they're consistent from year to year, but something like a promotion or a business interruption would be very difficult to capture with an automated time series approach. It does not capture the response to explanatory variables. Okay, by definition, again, the time series is using the past only. If things like how prices are changing, how the economy is changing, how temperature changes, if these things drive what we're trying to forecast, then this approach is not likely to work very well. Implementations vary and some are poor. I have seen some very poor forecasting automated approaches that are just simply don't get the job done. Back to the beginning slides, that the data can vary. You can have data that are seasonal and trended. You can have data that is low volume or high volume. And if we're going to use an automatic approach, we really need to make sure it's a good one that can accommodate a lot of different types of data. And I've seen there are some good ones out there, and there are some not so good ones out there. And so it's sort of a buyer beware. Okay, so I use an automatic method, and I generate some forecasts. And as I'm reviewing the forecasts, I disagree with the forecast that I generate, or that the automated approach generated. So what am I going to do? I look at the forecast and I say it's no good. Well, my job as a forecaster is to reject it and to improve the forecast. And generally speaking, there are a number of ways I can do this, but I'm going to talk about three common things that I might do. One is I could judgmentally change the forecast. So I could say, I don't like that. I'll make some adjustments and change some numbers. I could say the automatic approach chose the wrong method, and I'm going to choose a method that's better suited. So I could use a different statistical forecasting method and change the model. Or maybe I look at the forecast and determine there's something wrong with the input data which is keeping the automatic methods from working well, so I'm going to attack it by looking at the data that we're using to generate the forecast. So these are things we can do when we reject the forecast. And now we're going to look at each of these sort of in turn. And to know what to do depends on why is it wrong. Okay? So why is the forecast wrong? And I've listed some reasons here, and this is the meat of the presentation. Why is it wrong? Well, it might be wrong because you know something about the future. That's domain knowledge, which is not in the model. It might be wrong because the automatic approach chose the wrong forecasting method. It used, for instance, let's say a non-seasonal model for something I know to be seasonal. It might be wrong because we don't have enough data. You know, maybe we just switched over to a new ERP system 7 months ago. I only have 7 months worth of data. I try to generate an automatic forecast, and I start to notice that all the forecasts are really lousy. and I say, you know what, we need to go back to that ERP system, and we need to load in some of the old demand data so we can improve our forecast. So maybe I've got problems with the data. And then finally, maybe an automatic approach, the time series method simply is not appropriate. Again, remember, time series is based on past demand, and maybe for this particular item, that's not appropriate. Okay, so let's look at each of these. Why is it wrong? Maybe it's I know something about the future. So my knowledge of the future leads me to reject the forecast. Very often when my knowledge of the future is the driver, I'm going to be adjusting the forecast. This might be done informally, so I might just look at that. I might go perhaps ask a few questions of people and then go enter some changes. Or I might have a formally structured process, maybe an S&OP series of meetings where designed to get input from other people throughout the organization. But essentially, again, I'm going to adjust some numbers. This display shows an example of adding judgment, and I just want to point out a couple of things. One is there's a statistical forecast. So this is our baseline. This goes back to what I said before, which is if we're going to make adjustments, let's start by saying here's what the past tells us. If things continue on the way they have been, this is what we can expect. That's the statistical forecast. In this example, I've got a couple of what I would call override rows. I've got a row for salespeople to go in there or management to go in there. And they can go in and make some changes and document why the changes are made. And that results in this last row, which is the final forecast. And that would go off to production or to wherever it's destined to go. But the elements here are we have a baseline forecast, we have adjustments there too, and we have a final forecast which reflects the changes. When I'm going to be making adjustments, I want to make sure that ideally I retain both the baseline forecast, the statistical forecast, and the final forecast, that is the adjusted forecast, so that I can track accuracy of both and understand if the changes are adding value. I also want to document the reasons why I made the changes. Most people are forecasting on a routine basis, so every week or every month we're going to revise the forecast, and if we document the work, that makes it easier for us to do it. And if we move on and take a different position, within the company or leave the company, then whoever takes over the forecasting process, it's easier for them too. The more documentation, the better. Okay, so again, when our knowledge of the future tells us the forecast should be rejected, very often we're going to add judgment. What if we chose the wrong time series model? So the concept of using the past to go forward is a good one, but I look at the forecast and I reject it because I think it used the wrong one. Okay? So often this might be a case of misidentifying trends and or seasonal patterns. So again, my automatic approach perhaps comes up with a non-trended forecast for something that I know should have a trend. So what should I do there? Well, if you think that the automatic approach chose the wrong model, then let's customize it a little, and we will choose the right model. So we want to dictate an appropriate time series method to use when we think that the automatic approach failed. And exponential smoothing is often a good choice. So I'm going to take a very quick look at exponential smoothing. I know a lot of us will already be familiar with this. It's really a family of methods. It forecasts 3 different components: sales levels, trends, and seasonal patterns. It assumes that these components can change over time. It assumes that there's random variation, part that we won't be able to understand completely. It's adaptive, and it uses weights to help determine how much emphasis should we give the recent history versus the more distant past. And it forecasts based upon what we call final values, or let's think of them as current conditions. What's the current trend? What's the current seasonal pattern? And let's use that when we generate a forecast. This is a picture of forecasts that come out of exponential smoothing models. And some of them have names, things like Simple, Holt, and Winters. But But the main purpose of the slide is to point out there are different ways that I could forecast, for instance, the trend. It might not be trended, so it would be flat. It could be a linear trend or a straight line trend, and I'd have to determine the slope and where to start. It could be a damped trend, one that starts off linear and dies out with time. Or it could be, for instance, an exponential trend, one that grows as a percentage of itself. But the main point is there are different types of trends, there are different types of seasonal patterns, and going back to our theme of when I think a time series method is appropriate, but I think the automatic approach failed to choose one, very often we'll come here and we'll think about, are the data trended? If so, how? Are the data seasonal? If so, how? And then choose what's appropriate, and rather than relying on the automatic approach for that particular item, we'll choose what we know to be a superior approach. So let's see how this works. We're going to look at an example. And here's an item. It happens to be sales of a certain type of cake. It's a pound cake. And we've used an automatic approach. And it's come up with a trended forecast, so you can see it's trended. But it's not seasonal. And I won't spend too much time here, but if we looked at the reasoning behind the automatic approach, we can notice the series is too short to determine seasonality, treating as non-seasonal. So we've got a little over a year's worth of data, and it's not enough to determine whether it's seasonal. On the other hand, I know this is a seasonal product. Most food products are seasonal. They sell more around the holidays. There's certain times of the year where people eat different types of food, and I know this to be seasonal. So I'm going to override it. And the way I do it in this package, this is Forecast Pro that I'm illustrating this in, but in any software you're using, there's going to be some sort of comparable ability, is I'm going to go there and I'm going to say, rather than letting the program decide, I'm going to decide. And I'll choose exponential smoothing. And in this case, I'll choose a model called Winters, which is a seasonal model as well as being trended. And that changes the forecast quite a bit. So now you can see the forecast reflects the seasonal pattern. And you can also see what we call the fit, or how we track, and it tracks the data much better. And in short, this is just a much better product, or a better forecast rather. And again, what we've tried to illustrate there, I'm going to go back to our slides, is our knowledge of the data basically said the automatic approach chose the wrong model. It chose a non-seasonal approach for something we know to be seasonal, and so we went and dictated that we should use a seasonal approach. Okay, our next one. We have data problems. Okay, maybe the data are too short, so I don't have enough data. Maybe it's a new product of some sort. Maybe the data are too low level. You know, I'm trying to forecast at a SKU by customer by location. Or my boss said I need a forecast for every 10 seconds. Okay, so it's just we're asking too much given what the data can support. So what do? Well, let's continue the data. Let's consider rather the data being too short. And if the data are short, that could be because it's a new product. And so we'll talk a little bit about new product forecasting. There are different types of new products. So one thing you might have is what we call replacement products. So let's say that I work for Procter & Gamble, and I have different types of toothpaste, and I go in and we have a new and improved formula, and it gets a different SKU, but it's really the same, you know, from the consumer point of view. I'm still going in, I'm still buying my favorite brand, I still want the same size tube, but I get there and the label says new and improved. I buy it. It's replaced the old one. And the other thing about that, I mean, from the company point of view, it's a different product. It has a different SKU code. It has to be forecasted separately. From the consumer's point of view, it's a replacement product. It's really the same. Or maybe it's an extension. Maybe, you know, we used to have 7 different types of toothpaste. We've just added, over the last 6 months, we've added 3 new ones. We've got a, you know, one with extra whitening. We've got a cinnamon flavor, whatever. And maybe we've retired a couple as well. So we could have product line extensions where it's, you know, we've changed change the line a little bit, and we can also have reductions. But if we have replacement products or product line extensions, this can yield short data sets, which are difficult to forecast. Maybe it is a new product that's really new to the company. We've been selling toothpaste for a long time, and we just introduced a line of toothbrushes. So that's new to the company. We haven't competed in that space before. On the other hand, toothbrushes have been around for quite a while, and we'll have competitors in this product, which is new to the company. And then finally, you have new to the world. So the company invented something, and that's the very hardest type to forecast because, again, there's very little guidance in the form of experience, direct experience with the products. So the type of new product you're trying to forecast will often dictate what approach should be considered. In the case of replacement products or product line extensions, we have data for the predecessor products or for the product line as a whole, and we're going to leverage that. All new products, we might have judgment and market research, but with replacement products and product line extensions, we might be looking at mapping histories. We call this item supersession, or maybe going top-down. We'll talk about both of these. In item supersession, what we're really talking about is creating a forecasting history for the new product using the demand history of the predecessor products and the new product. For a replacement product, this could be very simple. If it was just a straight replacement, we might just merge those two histories for forecasting purposes. If, again, we were sort of phasing some new ones in and some out, then the allocation might be more involved. So, but in the simplest, you have the old product, and there's the demand history for the old product. You have a new product, and there's some demand history for the new product. And you can see in this case I have a short period where they overlap. But basically for forecasting, I want to combine those. And even though these had different SKU codes in my database, for forecasting purposes, I want to create a merged history and generate a forecast based on this merged history. So a very simple example of how to do that. Another option would be to go top-down. Top-down basically leverages the fact that you may have data at a group level that goes back quite a ways, even though the individual end items may be changing and some of them may be short. So in the example I'm about to show you, we've got sales cough syrup, and we've been selling cough syrup for a number of years, so we've got a lot of history at that level. And then we have what's currently offered, and this changes a lot. So what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on the top level cough syrup data, and we're going to create a forecast based on that data. It is higher volume, it has more structure, it has more history, and we can forecast that pretty well. And then what we're going to do is to allocate that forecast downward, okay? And so that to improve the forecast. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that with an example. So here is some data. It is sales cough syrup. We have the green is sales at the group level. So this is total cough syrup. And we've got a little over 3 years worth of history. And these three lines at the bottom, these are the current products, the current three that we're offering. And so the group includes some SKUs or some products that we're no longer selling. And if you look over here on the left, you can see there's these ones in gray are actually the discontinued items. The ones in green are the ones on the graph. Basically, the opposite of going top-down is what's called going bottom-up. And in a bottom-up approach, which I'll do first, I'll go ahead and generate a forecast. You take these low-level items and you generate a forecast based on their history. And you can see that's generated a bunch of flat lines because the data are so short. All three of these are less than a year. And in a bottom-up approach, I would add together these three lower-level items to get the forecast for the group, which is the green. I'd go ahead and give this to my boss and be immediately fired. Okay, so this is a very bad forecast because, again, at a group level, I can tell that the cough syrup is very seasonal, etc., but I'm not using that data when I go bottom up. The alternative is to go top-down. And if I do that, I'll just put it top-down up here at the cough syrups. That changes these forecasts rather dramatically. So now the green forecast is actually used. It's based on the demand history for total syrups, and I generate a forecast. I then allocate it downwards, and I can introduce, for instance, some of the seasonal pattern that's very clear up at the group level down to the lower items. Okay, so it's, again, I like this example because it's a very stark difference between a top-down and bottom-up approach. And in this case, with the fact that we've got these product lines where the items are constantly being phased in and out, it works quite well. Okay, let's go back to some slides here. And there are other approaches for true new products. We've been focusing on replacement products and product line extensions. In the time we have, we won't actually go through examples of these, but there are methods like forecasting by analogy. Some people call it looks-like analysis, which are designed for new products where you base it on a product you feel would be similar. There are some assumption-based modeling, market share forecasting, diffusion models. There's a lot of different approaches specifically for new product forecasting when we've got new to company or new to world. Okay, so why is it wrong when we're dealing with data? The data could be too short, or the other option here is it's too low level. There's not enough structure in the data. Okay, sometimes this is driven by management, and it's kind of the curse of being a good forecaster. You know, you come in and you generate a really good forecast on a monthly basis, and your manager says, gee, you know, it'd be great to look at this on a weekly basis. Why don't you do that? And and all of a sudden your life is much more difficult. Or, you know, you're doing a great job forecasting at the SKU level. Can we get it down to the customer? So at times we may be asked to do something that takes us down to a very low level, and we may need to push back. We may say, look, I don't want to forecast at a customer level. We don't actually need it for production, and the forecasts are going to be much less accurate if we do that, and my job will be much harder as well. We could also go top down. We could work with different time buckets. So if I'm asked for a weekly forecast, you know, I can either work with weekly data, or maybe I could work with monthly data if indeed I can still make the decisions that need to be made. So part of this is when we're asked to do something where the forecasts, the data really kind of preclude it, there's not enough structure, we need to communicate this to management and ask, is it really necessary? And the answer may be yes, or it may be no. And if it's no, then let's try to keep it as simple as we can and still get the job done. When the answer is yes, though, we really do need a daily forecast, then you're gonna have to decide how to do that. One option here listed, again, we could forecast top-down. We could also use what we call bucket conversions. Basically, a bucket conversion says if I'm forecasting, say, on a weekly basis, so I have a weekly bucket, so to speak, and I'm asked for a forecast, say, for each day, I could either forecast based on daily data, or I might forecast on weekly data and then allocate it down to the days. So this allocation from weeks to days is sort of converting from weekly buckets to daily buckets, and we call that bucket conversion. Okay, there are different ways you could do it. You could just do a flat allocation. So I could take my weekly forecast and divide by 7 and allocate 1/7 to each day of the week. I could look at through history and maybe notice that Fridays and Saturdays I sell more than others, and I sell maybe less on Sundays, and I could come up with some sort of historical profile to do the allocation. Perhaps I might even forecast at the daily level and the weekly level and base the allocation on the different forecasts. Some people would call that a bucket synchronization because I'm synchronizing the weeks and the daily forecast. But again, when we have data problems, or if the automatic approach is failing because of data, there are various things we can do. Okay, our last category of why am I rejecting the automatic forecast is that the automatic time series-based forecast is based solely on the past. And at times that's appropriate, and at times it's not. So if I have things that move around the calendar, a time series method is not going to work very well. If I have items that are being driven by explanatory variables, things outside of just the past demand, then again, the automatic time series isn't going to capture that. So what do we do when things move around the calendar? Well, let's think about things that could move around the calendar. Promotions are certainly the most common. If I'm in certain businesses where holidays are important, certainly food and beverage would be a good example of that. Then the timing of Easter. You know, what week does it fall in this year? Because it moves around, or even what month, or things like other holidays that move around the calendar. If I've got business disruptions, you know, if I'm doing building materials, then the occurrence of earthquakes and hurricanes and other disasters may drive a lot of business. And there's lots of things that can occur which would make strictly forecasting from the past problematic. One approach here is to try to adjust your history. So let's change the history to remove the impact of, say, promotions. So we're going to separate the base demand from the promotion demand, for instance. That's usually pretty hard to do because it's a question of, now I have to try to figure out, if it wasn't on sale, what would I have sold? So I would say, unless it's a very clean operation where I can truly separate the demand streams, in general, it's hard to work by adjusting the data. The other option is to use a method that is designed to capture these kinds of things. And one is a time series extension model. There are many of them. We're going to take a quick look at something called an event index model. Box-Jenkins or ARIMA has intervention models. There are a bunch of extensions that allow us to bring in more than the past history. Or we can move into a true multivariate model which has explanatory variables. So what is an event? Well, it's an extension of exponential smoothing. It is based on indexes. For those who are familiar with, for instance, the Winters model uses indices for the seasonal pattern. An event model would use indices for the events. It requires an event schedule. This is the big thing. So in addition to the past history, we provide it with a record of when these events have occurred in the past and when they'll occur in the future. Our example is sales of mouthwash. And here you can see it has a lot of spikes in it. And these are being driven by promotion. And so the demand for mouthwash is not seasonal, and this particular brand is not trended. But there are price promotions by both the manufacturer and competitors, and that's what's driving these spikes. It's a particularly hard one because the promotions are often in the same periods every year. And so as a stream of numbers, it looks seasonal. So if we were to graph this year over year, it would match up most of the time. And it fools automatic algorithms. The other thing about this data is a lot of volume goes through Walmart, and in this section of the data, Walmart went into an everyday low pricing category, and the response to price promotions changed because Walmart and a couple of the other big box retailers were not responding to the price promotions anymore. They had already contracted for better pricing. So with an event model, I'm going to show you a very quick example. So here is that data. If I forecast it using an automatic approach, here's the forecast, and it treats it as seasonal, and I get a very seasonal forecast going forward. And the problem is it's not seasonal data. It looks like it statistically, but it's not. So if I look at how we track the data, you can see things like peaks where we're trying to put them in, but they're not actually there. Here's a great big peak that occurred that we missed. And in general, we just kind of get it wrong a reasonable fraction of the time. And again, what we're dealing with here through our own knowledge of the data is something that was promoted. And that's why this automatic approach really is not working. To build my event approach, I'm going to add what we call an event schedule to this. And you can see it yields a very different forecast. that reflects really when the promotions are occurring in the future. And you can see it really tracks the data much, much better. We're not putting in peaks where they don't exist and missing them when they do. So it's, again, in cases where we've got highly promoted items or things that are moving around the calendar, this can be an awfully good approach. Okay, so again, we looked at something where the events are moving around the calendar, and we used an event model to help us. The other option would be explanatory variables, and this would lead us to regression. Regression has a lot of advantages. For one thing, again, we can incorporate these explanatory variables. We can learn about relationships between variables. If one of our variables is price, we might be learning about how changes in price change our sales, and that can be very useful information in addition to just generating a forecast. It allows for what if. What if we raise the price? How would that change the forecast? What if we lowered it? It can exploit leading indicators. These are things that are running ahead of what we want to forecast. There's some downside. It's not automatic, and in fact it requires considerable skill and expertise to use it well. It can produce poor forecasts if the explanatory variables cannot be forecasted well. So I could have a model that explains, let's say I determine that I'm being driven by the unemployment rate, and I can build a model that really quantifies the relationship between my sales and the unemployment rate. But to actually generate a forecast with it, I now need to forecast the unemployment rate going forward, and that may be very difficult. It requires a fair amount of data. To nail down these relationships, you want some data. What types of variables do business forecasters use in regression? Things like prices are very common. Promotional schedules are very common, or promotional variables rather. These are what I'd call internal variables. These are things the company has control over, at least some control over. Sometimes you're being driven by things you can't control. You know, if we're about to look at an electric power example, we're very driven by temperature. If it's very cold, people turn on the heat. If it's very hot, they turn on the air conditioning, and it changes our demand. If we're driven by the economy or competitive action or changing demographics, these are all examples of variables that are external to the company. So in this example, which we'll just do on slides, I've got sales of electricity. It's a very seasonal product, and temperature is very important. If I use an automatic time series approach, that's what's on the screen at the moment, I get a reasonable forecast. It's certainly seasonal. But if I look at it, I start to notice that where I really miss things are on the peaks, that I'm often either undershooting or overshooting on these peak demand periods, which this is sales of electricity in Washington, D.C. It gets real hot in the summer in Washington, D.C., and that's why the sales are so high, people running air conditioning. With time series, things like this, where I had a very hot summer followed by a cool one, that's what drove the demand for electricity, and the time series method just isn't going to get that. If I add temperature, then this is the kind of results I get. You can notice that change between the hot summer and the mild one is captured perfectly. And for this type of data, an accuracy of 99% is common. So we've got data that's very highly forecastable. Obviously, electric power data has much, much more structure than a lot of the data that we've been looking at previously. But let's summarize, and then we've got a little bit of time for questions. So the first thing I want to mention here is that judgment is important. It's always part of forecasting, but as a best practice, we want to add judgment as an adjustment to a statistically generated baseline forecast so that we can track whether it's adding value or not. Automatic time series approaches work well many times when you have enough data, and they're generally going to outperform simple spreadsheet models and adding judgment to them. So they do add value, but there are times where you should reject them. And when you do reject them, as we've been discussing, what do? Well, we could judgmentally override the forecasts. We could choose a different model, whether, again, it might be a form of exponential smoothing or maybe a multivariate model or a new product forecasting model. But we could say we've got to use a different model. Or maybe we look at the data and we say, how can we change the data so that our time series method is going to work well? So again, there are many times where you'll want to improve your process by overriding an automatic approach, and that's often a good thing to do. I want to take just a couple of seconds here, and actually I'm going to click over here to the Forecast Pro website. And one of the things I want to point out is if you visit the website, under Resources, we have webinars. And this is what we call the Webinar Archive. And a lot of the topics that I've been talking about, we have pre-recorded webinars. You can come here and run them for free. And you can get more detail on some of the things we've been talking about. So for instance, the bucket conversion is covered in more detail in this Forecasting Weekly and Daily Data. Scroll down a little bit. Exponential smoothing. We've got a webinar that talks about exponential smoothing in more detail. Event modeling. There's a recorded webinar that talks about events. Top-down approaches. There's a webinar that talks about product hierarchies. New product forecasting. Regression modeling. I know that this presentation has been very general, and that was by design, but some of the pre-recorded ones go into more detail. So if during this presentation you said, hey, I want to know more about those event models, this is one resource that I'll point you towards. Okay. Before we start our questions, I'm just going to mention a couple of other little things here. In addition to forecasting software, BFS, or Business Forecast Systems, also offers webinars and product training workshops. We can deliver content both by coming on site and via remote-based, usually via WebEx. And we've been using Forecast Pro to illustrate the different methodologies that we've been talking about. And if you want to learn more about Forecast Pro, our website is a good place to start. And in fact, if you want even more depth, then you can request a live demo of Forecast Pro. We'd love to show it to you. And in fact, one way to do that is if you submit on the chat box, if you'd like to get a live demonstration of Forecast Pro, then send us a note right now. And Eric Sabatis, our moderator, but also our sales director here, will get back in touch with you and direct you or set you up an appointment to show you what we can do for you. So again, if you are interested in the software, please let us know, and we're happy to tell you more about it. If you've enjoyed the webinar and you want to come to our next one, our next live webinar is going to be on tracking forecast accuracy. We do one a quarter, so the next one will be in April, and I'll actually be presenting it. We'll talk about how to track forecast accuracy. We'll look at things like best practices, different types of error measurements, within sample versus out of sample errors, and how to monitor, as we're tracking, how to spot poor performance and improve it. So it should be a good session, and we'll cover a lot of ground on tracking forecast accuracy. So at this point, we are pretty close to, well, we have actually gone a little past an hour because we had so much content, but we'll take a few minutes and answer a couple of questions. I do want to emphasize something that Eric Sabatis mentioned earlier, which is any questions that we don't get to answer live, we will answer by email after the session is over. But let's take just a handful of questions live. And Eric, you got one for me?
Yeah, our first question has to do with multiple levels of data. And the question is, at what level of the data or the hierarchy is it recommended that we make overrides or use top-down? And related to that, if we did have multiple levels, what might be the highest one would want to go in that structure?
Okay, so it's a good question. It's actually probably two questions in there. Let's start with just the adjustments. So at what level should we be adjusting our forecasts? And should we do it at multiple levels? Okay, I would say a best practice would be to only adjust at one level if possible. Okay, it keeps the process simple and it keeps the reconciliation very simple. What level should it be? That depends on the organization and depends on the structure of the hierarchy. What I would say is when we make adjustments, we should look at how we're using the forecasts. If the forecasts are going to be used to produce something, let's say at an SKU level, then probably that's where the adjustment should be made. So if they're for production or planning or scheduling or something like that, then it's at what level is it going to change the action we're going to take. On the other hand, if our business is such that we have some key customers and the salespeople get direct feedback from them, then maybe we'd be operating at a customer level in that case, because that's where our information is based. So like many things in forecasting, the answer is it depends, and you need to get a little more specific into the specifics of the organization. The other question was, where do you do top-down? And that's really a forecasting question. Once again, the question is it depends, but there's a little more guidance here. What you want to think about is, where is the demand being driven from? In the example in the webinar, we were using sales of cough syrup, and I went top down from a cough syrup level. That was very logical. The demand is really being driven at that level. If me as a consumer who is creating demand goes to buy cough syrup, I sort of walk into the store, I look at what's on the shelf, I see, oh, there's 6 different size bottles here and a couple of different flavors. Those are the SKUs. And cough syrup is something where, I don't really know what's going to be on the shelf before I go in there. It'd be perfectly logical to work at that level. So you try to think like a consumer, where's the demand being made? If that same company in the hierarchy also had other products, so if in addition to cough syrup we also had inhalers for asthma, I'm not going to buy an inhaler if they're out of cough syrup, okay? So I wouldn't go top down from the very top if I'm going across items that are very different. Another question.
All right. Our second question is, seasonality and trends can be relatively straightforward, but can you offer any tips for longer-term business cycles and how one might identify reversals or changes in those cycles?
Okay, that's a good question as well. First of all, just an agreement, which is forecasting the current trend is relatively straightforward. I can look at what the current trend is and project it. Forecasting the current seasonal pattern, same thing. And most time series methods which are basing on past history, are for relatively short-term forecasts. A longer-term forecast, you worry about the trends changing. So maybe the economy turns and what had been a positive trend turns into a negative trend, etc. Trying to get the turning points is difficult. It depends a little on your industry. So what you're trying to do, though, is instead of working with the past, you try to bring more information. So if I'm in a pharmaceutical company and I'm doing sales of a drug, I might look at projecting the patient population, which is sort of more of a whole. If I'm tied to a country's economy, it's particularly hard and nobody really does it well. I might go to something like Global Insights or one of the economics providers and get some expert opinion of where the economies are going. But if you look at some of the research on the accuracy of forecasting the economy long term, nobody does it well. And so I think what's important there is when we deliver a longer term forecast, we also deliver to management some expectations about the uncertainty around it. So this is the forecast, but it really assumes that the economy keeps on, the course. Or this is the forecast, and it assumes that the patient population, that we're going to saturate the market at a certain point in time. Okay, I'd say time for one more.
All right, and our last question then is, how do time series approaches work for sporadic or intermittent sales data?
Okay. The answer is reasonably well, and the caveat there would be reasonably, because there is no, first of all, let's think about sporadic sales. Typically what we're talking about is you look at the demand history, there's a lot of zero demand periods with occasional sales. So low volume items, they could be, could be spare part forecasting, it could be, something where it's a very high ticket item which aren't forecasted, we don't sell one every period. There are methods which are designed specifically for it. There's the Croston's technique is one of them. There's some bootstrapping methods, which is another. Some people simulate them. So what I would say is with sporadic demand, you want to make sure if we're using an automatic approach that it does have methodology in it to address sporadic demand. Because if it doesn't specifically have those kind of methods in the automatic selection process, then it's going to apply something like, for instance, exponential smoothing, which will not work well. So the question becomes, where I said before, when you start to look at software for automatic model selection, it varies, and some implementations are strong and some are poor. And I would point that this is one area that if I've got low volume items, if I've got sporadic demand, I want to be particularly careful for that the automatic approach is robust enough to cover those cases. In Forecast Pro, we do support the Croston's methods, which is for sporadic demand. We have a couple of other low volume items, and we recognize when that data is passed to it and act accordingly. But if you're using a different system, then again, it's something to research when making your software selection kind of process. Okay. Well, again, we have other questions that have been submitted. I can see on the screens to my right here, and we will be sending email responses to the questions we didn't get to. But I'd like to thank everyone for attending our webinar today. And again, I hope you've learned something today. And if there are any questions that occur to you going forward, feel free to shoot us an email. And we hope to quote-unquote see you all at the next webinar. So thanks again.
Muted.